We have three teams in the quarterfinal. We have on first proposition HWSWM. On first off, St. John's FM. And in a Cornell-dominated back half, we have on second government's Cornell SZ. And on second opposition, Cornell SR. Congrats everyone for making it this far. Best of luck. My name's Isaac. I'll be your chair. My lovely panelists include the lovely Tom Giannasotis. Without further ado, I will call to the floor the Prime Minister to introduce the bill which will bear his name.
All right, thank you, Mr. Speaker. All right, now right now we see the problem in the status quo with a lot of countries, given the current economic downturns, of instituting policies that are somewhat fiscally irresponsible. We see states that are doing things that are we see as reckless, like throwing money at their economy in an attempt to try and bring their country and bring their citizens out of recession. Now, with the development of the euro and with the unionization of European countries under the European Central Bank, we see a particular risk involved with these types of practices in the status quo. First of all, I'd like to point out that these practices don't always work. We've seen empirically that throwing money at an economy doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And I'm going to get into a little bit more of that with my points on economic analysis. Second of all, the second problem we see with this is that if they do any good, if these policies do any good whatsoever, it's only going to help the state that initiates the policy rather than the union as a whole, which we think is an unfair advantage to the state that actually institutes these risky methods. And third, the problem we see that is different given the context of the European Union is that when these states do these fiscally irresponsible things, the burden of risk is placed on all of the countries in the union rather than simply the country that takes the risk as a whole. So, for these reasons, we believe that this House would support the European Central Bank having veto power over their individual state budgets or member states' budgets. So for our model, this House would support a model that would allow the governing body of the European Central Bank to have veto power over the states' budgets. What this will look like after the plan is passed is that a governing body of the European Central Bank will be, with members from all of its member states, represented, will evaluate budgets as a whole and decide whether or not they're fiscally responsible, as well as whether or not they are good ways of spending money as a whole. What will happen is states will submit their budgets annually or quarterly or however the European Union Central Bank would do it. They would submit them. The governing body would evaluate them. If they do not think they're approved, states can resubmit their budgets after that and until they're approved. And then we'll come to some consensus that way. So from this model, we see a couple of very important benefits from this policy in particular. The first of which is that we avoid this risk of the ECB crashing from defaulted loans. Because as we've said, these huge risks taken on by individual states put the entirety of the European Union at risk. Go ahead.
Deficit spending and other things the government deal with fiscal policy. The European Central Bank is a monetary policy organization. Why is your side decided to do it?
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. But what we see, a good example of this would be to look at the United States federal government. The Fed as a whole is a monetary organization, but the Fed still has power to veto when the individual states do fiscally irresponsible things. They can't take states can't take money out of the Federal Reserve to do things that are irresponsible. So for that reason, we think that first of all, we're going to avoid the risk of defaulting on these loans, the money that's taken out of the European Central Bank. We've seen empirically, and in fact incredibly recently, that fiscal austerity is a virtue, and that it is important for states to be fiscally irresponsible. Because if you look at the American and European economy, the results that, just recently of all of the recessions and borderline depressions that we've seen are the result of unregulated financial spending and unregulated fiscal policies. And it's for that reason that we don't think that these sorts of policies should be allowed, especially in the case when they put the entirety of the union at risk. So, also, these stimulus plans don't tend to work because if you look to the multi-billion-dollar stimulus plans that we've seen in America, they haven't had the benefits that they've foreseen, and we're still in trouble in this country insofar as in the economy. So when you throw money at a recessed economy, it's an important point to bring out here because I think this is going to be an important part. When you throw money at a recessed economy, when you do things like that, the tendency isn't for people to spend this money and put it back into the economy, which is like, in theory, what would happen. When people are shocked by recession, they tend to save their money, and they tend not to be as fiscally promiscuous as they would be like in an inflated economy, or an economy in which like everything seems all right. So the second point we see is this also creates a sort of system of checks and balances among the union, which we think like they have now, but like it's also important that like this be in the economic sector, because yeah, you in the back.
So the Fed can control state budgets. We all know what a wonderful place America today is economically. Look at California, ladies.
Right, but just because America, like that American policy, like America's economy isn't tied to that like particular. That's like a correlative thing rather than a causal thing. It's not because the Fed can regulate state budgets that America sucks. It's because Americans are like have like a lot of like less financial regulation than we think we probably need, right? Like because we're irresponsible, like we have a tendency to like do bad things with our money, and that's why like people think we have a bad economy. So on the system, what we're trying to make about the system of checks and balances. After this plan is initiated, then these countries will have representatives, and amongst themselves will have a sort of control over what economic policies are allowed to exist, which we think is important in a couple of ways. The first way is that, one, they're going to be allowed to like assess each other's like risky things. Like they're not going to be able, like allowing each other to do risky things, like take huge sums of money to like inject into their economy with the hopes that it'll work, while like putting the risk on everyone else. In addition to that, we're also going to see like in a different way, they're also going to be controlling budget spending that's going to be doing dangerous things or like politically like harmful things, which we think is also an important point to make, because like for example, like if France wants to take several $1 million out to like put towards like arms proliferation, like the European Union as a whole can say like, no, that's not a good use of money. Like we're not going to endorse it, and we're not going to put like our unit of currency at risk for doing something like that we don't really think is important. So like it's going to like create like a sort of like inter country system of checks and balances in like a little bit in politics, but mostly in economics, that we think is going to be on the whole like very helpful for like ensuring like the safety of the economy and like avoiding risks. So what have we told you today on side government? We've proposed a model that creates a higher degree of fiscal responsibility on the part of the individual states in the interest of the union as a whole. So we've showed you how we avoid risks in the status quo by being financially responsible and having these regulations that don't allow individuals to take risks that only have benefits to themselves, but have potential harms for the entirety of the union. And two, like the potential benefits from this policy in particular that allow states to like monitor each other and like kind of like make sure that each other are being like smart and like not doing dangerous things with the money that would bring the unit of currency down as a whole. Like we said, like if one country like does something dangerous, then the other country should be allowed to say something because it is in their interest because they are part of the unit of currency. So with that, thank you.
Okay. All right. I now call upon the leader of the opposition from St. John's. That is yours.
Mr. Speaker, I know you can appreciate this. There is a mendaciousness to the claims of side government in their claims about how economics work. They have conflated fiscal policy and monetary policy, and I will help the debate, understand the debate in the audience, and you help understand the difference between those two things and why it is essential that the power of budgets not be left in the hands of the European Central Bank, who has different goals and different needs, and how this will ultimately hurt the European Union as a whole. What I'm going to talk about in my main point is I'm going to focus a lot on like sovereignty and like the attack on sovereignty that's going on. But I'm not going to say attack on sovereignty bad. In fact, I'm going to give you 3 specific harms of why this attack on sovereignty is bad. First of all, I want to get into this idea. Like we would say that like there's a risk on all countries in the European Union. We would say this might be true to a limited extent, but not really. And as we can see in the fact that there's a borrowing on like different credit for like these European central governments. So let's say when Greece tries to run a deficit, we recognize that they have to pay a much higher premium on their bonds, like the 11% rate of return, as opposed to the 2% rate of return in Germany. So Greece faces a much higher direct risk when they decide to run these fiscal deficits, when Germany's effect is really indirect. So we would say that in this specific case, if the effects are primarily and substantially on Greece, that they should have control over what they decide to do in this specific authority. Like with this idea of like this idea of their example of like the Fed being a good example of this. First of all, no. The Fed is a monetary policy authority. Ben Bernanke can't go up and tell Barack Obama, we're going to veto your budget for this year because you're doing reckless and irresponsible things. Well, you can't tell the state of California, why are you spending that much money? And even if it could, and we would say that the relationship even then between like the Fed and the state of California is different. Because the relationship between the United States and individual states as a federation, as opposed to the EU being a confederation, is an important distinction to make, and I'll go into that in my main point more substantially. But distinct this idea of like fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is based on the idea of what a state can do with tax money and like borrowed money in order to create macroeconomic growth. Now, monetary policy in the EU functions on a different standard. It doesn't function on the thing is, we're going to create a currency for the most growth. The EU specifically says, we are going to target a rate of inflation and keep the currency strong. And it's done this way because the euro was created to compete as a reserve currency with the dollar, so there was a necessary need for this to be strong. And we would say in this specific case, like a strong currency necessarily helps like the exporters in the European Union, such as like Germany, more than the importers in the European Union, like a country like Greece. Like we would say in that specific circumstance, like a strong currency, like necessarily lends itself to exports. And we would say when you have an importing nation, like one thing you can do to help balance this imbalance out would be to spend more on infrastructure, which is an arm of fiscal policy like going forward, and an arm of like borrowing money or using tax money going forward. So we would say that this actually provides a nice balance of like a unified monetary policy and being able to balance out the needs of the individual sovereign states in the European Union in order to in order to facilitate their own needs. We feel that this is essential to like actually understanding. And their point about like the stimulus being bad, that's a misconception that's been brought forth by like bad politics in a lot of these nations. Like the stimulus actually did a lot of good in the United States, and there's evidence that the stimulus will do a lot of good in the European Union. Like we would say that there's not good evidence to say, well, if there's screw-ups, there might be stimulus going on. I'm like, okay, like it seems to have done a decent job solving the problem so far, so we don't feel like why should we abandon this if that's the main harm that they're talking about going forward. But I'm going to need to talk about this idea of like the attack on sovereignty going forward. Because it's a very unique attack on sovereignty, because if you control a state's budget, you control their authority to tax and you control their authority to borrow. And we believe that these are two essential things in the social contract has with any given state, has in any given state. We believe that I'll take you in a second. We believe that taxation and borrowing is necessarily indicative of the rights and responsibilities an individual has within these individual governments. And in that sense, should be controlled by the individual governments and not by an authority outside of those governments, who would not deal with the effects far less directly than the governments within these countries. Yes?
When governments in Spain, Portugal, and Greece have to fund their deficits by borrowing from the European Central Bank, how are fiscal policy and monetary policy not linked then?
Okay, they take different risks by borrowing from the European Central Bank. As we can see, there's a much higher rate of return demanded on these bonds. Their risks are different. We don't see that in a situation like the defaulting on Spain would cause like the main default of the European Central Bank, especially considering the different risks that are taken. Like it's not as if they're borrowing under one credit for the entire European Union. In that case, we would say, fine, yes, you can control fiscal policy. That's not what's going on, and we feel that that's a misperception on the part of side government. Second of all, this idea of the EU being a confederation. And not only is this like the way it is right now, and not only the way it is right now, but it's an important like distinction for it. Like we would say the difference between a confederation like the EU and a federation like the United States is like the United States federal government has direct authority over the 50 states within it. Has direct authority to do it. Like the confederation recognizes the sovereignty of all the states going forward. We recognize that these are still sovereign entities, and they give forth very specific circumstances in which like a government can step in. And even in that circumstance, like if we look at the treaty that like founded the European Union, the most revised treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, we recognize that there are certain opt-outs, because we recognize like this need for sovereignty in like these certain states. We would say like in the example of like Poland and Ireland, there were opt-outs to certain social standards of the EU, like disallowing abortion in their nations, because it was necessary for them to join. It was necessary to cause this protection to sovereignty for them to join the European Union in the first place. And we believe that if the idea of this being a confederation, the idea of the sovereignty of states being essential to why an organization was founded, this alteration to more of a federation type system where a European Central Bank would have like the power of the purse over each of these individual states would fundamentally change the organization that was agreed to be founded into. And we would say that they have to prove that the EU would still hold up in this circumstance when it was founded on something different going forward. And third of all, just the point of competition. We believe that even though the EU has one modified currency, it's done to make sure that there's a level playing field of competition within the European Union. We don't think competition in the EU is a zero-sum game. In fact, we think that there's competition within the economy of the European Union. It best facilitates growth going in the long term. Like, this is economics. Like, we would say, when countries are competing with one another, it'll facilitate other countries to become stronger in the European Union, and growth will go forward. Like, this is like one of the basic tenets of like economics in this specific circumstance. And we believe that like the current way the policy is right now, by having one standard monetary policy that prevents against like policies such as like protectionism and all these other things, does the best job to facilitate this competition, does the best job to facilitate this growth. But we don't feel you facilitate competition best when like authorities such as like Germany and like the European Central Bank can just create policies that will continue like their monetary policy being tied to inflation, and like trying to protect the currency at the expense of these other nations' abilities to cancel out, to work against some of the harms that like a policy this unified has created. But the fact is, when you ultimately understand what the European Union is, and we ultimately understand the authority it has and the authority that it's meant to have, we are proud to oppose this motion.
All right, thanks, George. And now the Deputy Prime Minister for 7 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, economics aren't really my bag, so I'm going to be talking about kind of more general responsibilities in my extensive manner, and then I'm going to rebut everything we just heard from the previous speaker. So first of all, I'm going to talk about how it's a good thing for states to generally be beholden to one another and like the goals that the other states have. And second of all, I'm going to talk about government perception and how we think we have better perception of government on our side of the house by the constituent people. Okay, so first on this point of like it generally being good to be beholden to one another. You obviously see this is the case in that we have organizations like the UN, like the EU, like the ECB, like NATO, which are bringing these states together specifically so that other states can be aware of what exactly it is that the states are trying to do. So the importance of this is that in the globalized world, when one country like China is like contorting the value of the yuan and like really screwing with that because that's what is in their best interest, you have to recognize that that impacts all the other states in the area in like really severe ways. That's why there's all this big hubbub about China doing this and why people are trying to address it in the status quo. So at that point where that's happening, you have to recognize that in the status quo, we don't really have a valid system of checks and balances to deal with people like China, to deal with people like Greece who are causing problems for the rest of us. So we think when we give the ECB this power, like an actual thing it can use, a real veto power to say, no, that budget's kind of ridiculous, you really shouldn't be doing this, we think that we take an impotent body and we make it be able to actually hold states in check, recognizing that they can and do impact other states. Okay, and then dealing with government perception real quickly. We just think that encouraging fiscal responsibility as opposed to like letting a government like just try whatever it wants, like kind of Obama just throwing money at the healthcare. Look what happened in that instance. So when you're just spending money as opposed to fiscal austerity, that is completely at odds with your average person's view of what exactly is going on in a recession. So like Andy told you, like your average person is trying to save money, trying to pull back, and we think that rationale should probably be represented by the government as well for the reasons that Andy gave. When the government doesn't do that, when they spend money and kind of do ridiculous things, people get kind of pissed off about it, and the party that's in power loses control, like they did in this election this past week. We think that when you have your people more in your corner by doing more sensible things, the government is better off, and that it has the support of its people. And so we think on that side, like you should side with our side of the house. Before I get into rebuttal, go ahead.
Yeah, yes, the average person didn't understand like the effects of the stimulus. And the average person doesn't understand economics, so why should we be listening to them as an authority of what to do?
Okay, well let me tell you what the effects of the stimulus was. Now, regardless of whether or not the average person understands what's happening, and by the way, we're still going to assert that what happened were very bad things, the average person perceived like there not being enough impact, and in that regard, they took power away from the Democrats. The Democrats have lost the House, Mr. Speaker. So whether or not the people know exactly what's going on, you still have to listen to what they want and respect that, because if you don't, you jeopardize control. Now, moving into some rebuttal then, they talked about like, well, how there aren't really risks, and kind of tried to point out some checks and balances we have with regard to Greece. Like, Greece pays higher premium on its bonds. Okay, so we're going to have two responses. First of all, we would be like better off if instead of Greece like doing this and paying higher premiums, we had just not let them do it in the first place. And second of all, we think it's weird that they're going to hang their hat on the example of Greece, considering how bad things have turned out in that particular situation. So obviously, we're not doing a very good job in the status quo, so, I don't know why they want to continue to do that. Clearly, that's not enough, and we need to take a further step and add this veto measure. Now, on this idea, no thank you, on this idea of sovereignty then, they said that it is important for a state to have like ultimate control of its authority to tax and borrow. Okay, so recognize that we're still leaving this control with them. We're not writing their budgets for them. We are letting them submit the budget, and if it's particularly heinous, then we say like, no, you really need to rewrite this and deal with this. We want there to be culpability when states do like harmful things like China or Greece. We want to be able to say like, here's the budget you submitted, you didn't do that thing, now you're causing problems for the rest of us, we think we should really address that. No thank you. Now, dealing with the idea of a confederation versus a federation. Okay, that's cool. The European Union is still going to be a confederation, obviously, but he said specifically that there are specific circumstances when we limit what states can do. Like, we obviously don't let them do anything. And we're going to say that this is one of those circumstances, right? Because in the case of economics, I'll take in just a minute, in the case of economics, it's not a moral issue like abortion. It has nothing to do with that. That is the viewpoint of one particular state. We're talking about a unit of currency which they all share, an economic claim which they all share, where their acts have like concrete impacts on others, and where there are obvious like objective standards you should be following. Do you disagree?
Yes, I disagree because the European Central Bank has no ideas about the idiosyncrasies and uniqueness of each European government.
Okay. So let's take a step back to the model then. We obviously said it was going to be the directing body of the European Central Bank, and we also said that it is made up of the constituent nations. So obviously, for one thing, their particular needs and goals are going to be represented. For another thing, we don't think you're going to get like one country steamrolling all the others because they're all like having an equal share in the decisions that are being made. All right, so we think that's a little silly. Now, dealing with fiscal versus monetary policy, all right, so I thought it was a good POI we got from the second half when they said that those are inextricably linked in a lot of ways. So I think on that point, like, that's a pretty strong point. Anyway, we think, for one thing, monetary analysts like Ben Bernanke, we think it would be better if they were able to better inform the decisions of government and like to have the actual power to do so through the forms of things like vetoes. Third, we think that state use cannot simply remain unregulated. Like, even if they should have like fiscal policy control, there are obvious limits of that. We're telling you that the limit is in the realm of economics, where they're going to be impacting other states. We'll let them legislate on things like abortion and whatever if they want, because that's not having like concrete harms like you see in the status quo in the case of places like China. We think there are clear lines on state sovereignty that should be drawn. And the final thing we want to say is that we can take the needs of these individual states into account. We can still respect like their fiscal policies because of the nature of the model that we've set up for you today. Now, the final thing they talked about were kind of the goals and needs of the ECB not matching up with those of the particular states. And I think that's all kind of been dealt with in what I've said so far. And we think, more importantly, the goals of the ECB are going to align with kind of the goals of the whole European Union. And rather than looking at like what one particular state needs, we're talking about like the whole currency and the whole plane of economics and how we should be dealing with that instead of particular nations doing things like selfish things like Greece. So on our side of the house, what we want to try to do is promote fiscal austerity measures like you see in France, where they're raising the pension age, right? We want to promote cutbacks and not heinous spending. We want those things to be reflected in the budget, and the ECB to accept those things, and to veto the states that are doing heinous things that are probably going to have negative impacts on the rest of the world. We think to not do that refuses to recognize the role that other states play in the security of the others in the globalized world, and we urge you to propose.
First off, it still has one speech left.
Ladies and gentlemen, the European Union is not the United States. They need to make something perfectly clear right off the bat. The European Union is a group of different countries that have come together under a single currency. There is no singular European government like there is here. There is no singular European social policies, although, okay, there are a few, but that doesn't mean that there's all the European countries have come together and seceded all their sovereign rights to become part of this one Eurozone. No, they've conceded some things, but not everything. The European Union is not a singular country. And when we talk about fiscal policies of individual nations, we're not talking about fiscal policies of a state. And that is the problem on side government's case, right? So what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to bring you a couple of points of refutation of the last speaker. I'm going to rebuild my partner's points, and I'm going to talk to you about what happens when we conflate the interests of individual nations in this way. So let's get into a couple of points that the last speaker brought up. And first of all, thank you for, first of all, we hear this idea about how it's generally good for states to be beholden to each other. For instance, in the UN and NATO. Well, first of all, those are bad examples because the kind of power you're giving the European Central Bank is not the kind of power that the UN has or NATO has, right? And secondly, we brought up the idea of China. Well, we wouldn't say that America should have control over China's currency policy. China is a sovereign state, right? We don't live in that kind of world government, and we don't think that's a good idea, right? So that's a terrible example for them to bring up. And secondly, they bring up this idea about how we're improving the checks and balances. No, again, all you're doing is you're corrupting the checks and balances that exist. The checks and balances being that the European Central Bank controls the monetary policies, and individual nations control the fiscal policies. And I'm going to get into that when I rebuild my partner's case, but I won't really have to spend much time because they didn't refute it very well. No thank you. Moving on, right? First of all, I'd like to point out a significant problem that exists on the government's case as a whole, which is that they promote financial austerity. They're against the stimulus, but they don't understand how stimuluses work. And secondly, even if that were true, right, this motion is a terrible way to go about it. If you want to promote financial austerity, promote financial austerity. Don't give incredible amounts of power to the European Central Bank, right? They keep talking about how the stimulus didn't work and it doesn't work, and then they talk about how it'll improve government perceptions, right? But again, bad example, guys, because the Democrats lost power, which shows that first of all, the stimulus sort of worked for a little while, and that's a good example of the fact that we shouldn't be relying on people to understand heavy economics, and we shouldn't be relying on this kind of thing. But ultimately, it also goes on to show that the government's perceptions aren't harmed because we can still change the government. Right? So I think ultimately that the case they brought is an indirect way of going about the kind of success they want, the kind of aims they want to achieve, and ultimately it just falls flat, right? Because what do we do when we give the European Central Bank this kind of power? What we're doing ultimately is we're conflating the two interests together. It's a confederation of different individual states, and when you give the power of controlling fiscal policy to the European Central Bank, when the European Central Bank controls a country's taxation rates, when it controls a country's borrowing rates, it essentially controls that country. Right? A country needs to. I'll take you in a second. In fact, no, thank you. I'll take you later. In fact, a country's taxation rates and borrowing rates are about how that country is going to govern, about how that country's infrastructure is going to work, about how that country's social programs are going to work. These are not things that the European Central Bank, A, has a mandate over, and B, has the power to control, and C, has the power to understand. Because the European Central Bank ultimately exists in one direct area with a bunch of economists, and we're giving them an incredible amount of power over every other nation's programs, because that's what fiscal policy does. But we do think that the European Central Bank should have some powers. That's why we give them the power of monetary policy, right? And that's the kind of checks and balances that we harm. Because ultimately, the European Central Bank's main purpose, right, is to prioritize inflation rates because they want to become a reserve currency. And so when they do that, we ultimately think that, yes, they will be able to institute some individual instances where they're able to control the inflation rate through monetary policy. And individual countries can offset that by fiscal policy, right? By borrowing a bit more if their currency winds up being overvalued or devalued. By borrowing a bit more or less. So fiscal policy and monetary policy exist in checks and balances. But if we give both of those things to the European Central Bank, we ultimately harm these countries' ability to govern themselves, which is very important considering they're not exactly states. So,
Okay, so even though these states are independent entities, they're still dependent on each other insofar as, like, if one collapses, the others then collapse. Like, look to the recession in 2008.
Yeah, okay, right, let's look to the recession of 2008, and ultimately we'll see that the European Union has been handling the situation fairly well, right? They've been promoting those financial austerity measures without your policy right now. So we think that they're doing a pretty good job of it. And ultimately we'd say that while they are pretty dependent on each other, they are not so dependent on each other that we can give the incredible power of, like, controlling a country's fiscal policy to the European Central Bank. So ultimately, what happens when we conflate these two interests, right? We don't think the European Central Bank is like this kind of like incredible like one voice for one country type thing, right? We'd say that countries like Germany, which ultimately have a much stronger economy these days, are much stronger within the European Central Bank as well. And if they have control over fiscal and monetary policy, over every nation within the European Union, because these European Union's individual states still compete against each other, as my partner pointed out, since they still compete against each other, and you're giving them both fiscal and monetary powers over these individual nations, what you're going to get is you're going to get a conflation of interests, and you're going to get some countries losing out and other countries winning. We see this in the status quo when, like, Germany comes out on top and Greece comes out on the bottom when we institute the Eurozone, and one currency gets devalued and the other country, and its exports become a lot higher and Greece's exports go a lot lower. And this is all we're going to see happen again, but at a much graver level when both monetary and fiscal policy is given to the European Central Bank. Ultimately, what we're doing is we're harming the Eurozone, we're harming every individual nation's sovereignty, and we're giving some nations an incredible advantage over others. This isn't something we can support, it's something that the European Union doesn't need and can't have. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. And now moving to the second half, second government.
As someone who frequently gets very angry at rounds, it's quite funny to see the opposition get so pissed off. What we'd say is they're pissed off about nothing. They're pissed off at a model that, like, proposition never proposed. The model that they're opposing is, well, if the EU says you have to spend 25% of your money on education and 25% of, like, your money on this thing and that thing, that's really, really bad because the EU doesn't have the right to dictate how countries spend their money. That's not what the proposition is. They're saying you can spend what you want given the taxes that you have. We're going to say if you spend too much, if you're being, fiscally irresponsible, what does that mean? If you're spending too much more than what your taxes are giving you. No one is saying the EU is going to say you have to spend this much on this or you have to tax a certain amount. We are saying bring your budgets to us. If that exceeds your taxes, we are going to say no because that's really, really bad for the rest of the European Union. So no one on side proposition is saying there's going to be any kind of an infringement on sovereignty as you would have on their side of the house. But more importantly, what Irene and I are going to show you are three main arguments. The first one is the individual in this scenario severely hampers on the collective. And as a collective entity, when that individual or these individuals have the right to harm the collective as a whole, they have the right to impose on these rules. No, thank you. The second argument we can say is the reason why these checks are really necessary is politicians within countries have a short-term interest to get elected. This means they're going to do really irresponsible things to gain popularity, and they will not think of the long-term security of their financial state. The final argument we make is no thank you. The political dependence that you would create by having these vacuums of credit is you'd have, intrusion like foreign capital such as China. But let's get on to, for example, more rebuttal about the sovereignty argument. No thank you. Because they said, well, it's a part of a federation, it's part of, a community, not part of a federation. Yes. But that community is also one of opting in. UK, for example, didn't opt into the system. They don't have the euro, and therefore they're not subject to those rules, right? It's something that if you sign on to such a system, we believe those rules should apply. No thank you. So let's get on to the first argument about how the individual, how the collective has that right to impose on the rules of these individuals. No thank you. Because we say their fates are closely tied, and the evidence of that was the crisis in 2008. What happened was, and I'm going to give you the link that First Proposition has tried to show you, was the idea that when these countries have deficits, they need to pay for them. No thank you. Where are they going to get the money? Especially in times of liquidity crisis, they have no money to turn to. The European Central Bank is the lender of last resort. They are politically obliged, as members of the European, the Eurozone, they have to lend money to them. What does that create? Number one, There is fear and uncertainty over whether or not these countries can even repay those debts, especially given the high premium rates that first opposition have shown us. Yes, sir?
Right. We are talking about the model that's being put forward today. They propose a veto power that cannot be overridden by the individual states. This is exactly tantamount to control.
And now I'm showing you why how that individual can severely harm the collective, and therefore the collective has the right to impose certain rules and conditions on those budgets. But number one, there's a threat that these countries won't be able to repay those things and therefore default. But secondly, where does that end, right? Because you have the lender of last resort. How much are they going to borrow, and how much can the European central government fund those deficits? So there is a crisis when it comes to this situation, not just no thank you of lack of liquidity, but also an issue of confidence. What happened in 2008 was people were really freaked out the euro was going to collapse because them as a whole is going down because these three countries were pulling the system down. What we'd argue is if you have a system of veto, that wouldn't happen because these countries wouldn't be able to borrow excessively and therefore threaten the liquidity of the eurozone as a whole. The second argument I'd like to make is about the idea that politicians often act in short-term interest, no thank you, and not in long-term interest. So what we'd argue is, especially in cases of crisis, right, when George, got elected in Greece, he wrote on the ties and said, I'm going to provide all these great welfare things so that he would get elected. Politicians have a bias towards expanding budgets and not reducing them because it's hugely politically unpopular. We look to the protests in France, for example. Sarkozy has been paying about $5 million lost every single day in those strikes. We look to the huge, unpopularity of those cuts in the UK. We argue that when you have politicians, no thank you, that are intrinsically biased towards expanding the welfare state and expanding budgets and not towards reducing them, we say you have to have this check in this scenario. No thank you. If you would have this veto, this would be a check on this political motive. The final argument that I read and I would like to make is the idea of a dependence on foreign capital.
Before you move on.
Go ahead.
Yes, the ECB members serve under term limits. They're economists, but they're also politicians. So they would also serve
That's untrue, right? That's simply untrue. The European Parliament has people that elect, parliamentary people to be on the European Parliament. People in the European Central Bank are appointed. They're insulated from that political agenda. We argue those two are completely unsimilar. It's like the Fed, right? Ben Bernanke isn't elected, he's appointed because he's really good at what he does. But the final argument I'd like to make is about political dependence of foreign capital. We say that when you have these cases of deficits, sometimes some countries choose to turn to foreign capital and not to the European Central Bank. Why is that? Because countries like China love to come in with their sovereign funds and give money at really, really low interest rates. Why would they do this? Number one, these countries are really, really weak. When you don't have liquidity, when the entire capital system is crashing down, nobody's willing to lend money. They're willing to come in at this moment of weakness and give you these huge amounts of money at very low interest rates. Why do they do this? Because they have an interest in making those political goals and those economic goals linked. There is, number one, the threat of withdrawal of these funds that are at severely low interest rates. We think that allows them to influence politics in certain ways, right? In foreign policy, we don't think it's right for them to be able to do that. But they're able to withdraw those funds. So what we'd argue too is, when you depend on foreign capital, it also exposes you to systematic risk in the international financial system. When you have scenarios in which you have to borrow from other people and you can't generate that capital on your own, I think that's incredibly dangerous. But what does that leave us with? It's a damned if you do and damned if you don't situation. If you don't have enough money to borrow from the European Central Bank, you have to rely on the foreign capital. If you rely on the foreign capital, then you're also subject to foreign interests and not your own. So we argue even if they don't borrow from the European Central Bank, you're still screwed because they're subject to and beholden to foreign capital, and that's really, really bad. So what have I told you today? Number one, I said when you become part of a collective and you opt into that system, you should have to have some rules imposed on you if your irresponsible behavior can screw everyone else over. The second thing we say is this check is incredibly important, especially because politicians act in their own selfish short-term interests and don't care about the system at large. The final thing we talked about is you expose yourself to foreign dependence on foreign capital, and that's really, really dangerous because it mingles foreign political interests with your economic interests. And for all these reasons, this case must stand. Thank you.
I know you've been waiting a long time for this. It's finally.
Apologies to my over enthusiasm. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will begin with some refutation, then I will move on to the two new arguments we're bringing to the table, which are basically the importance of the conflict between fiscal and monetary policy, why it's good, why it developed, and why it should stay, and secondly, the grand story of Europe. We believe in a strong and prosperous Europe, and we believe that what these guys are suggesting will doom it forever, and the cause for it in the history books will be the ridiculous overstepping of its limits of the European Central Bank. Let me begin with some of the rebuttals. Now, the Deputy Prime Minister talked about how basically the point of the government, I'm going to quote them, is to garner support of its people. He said something like that. But basically what your plan will do is just increase the antagonism against governments in these countries. There are examples of unrest, civil, social, from France, from Greece, everywhere. We believe that this does not contribute to a stronger Europe, and therefore we're against it. The member of government talked about how the European Central Bank will basically focus on total expenditure. Well, it will, because that is all that it can do. But this is a fatal flaw in your argument. It would not solve the problem of politicians overstepping their boundaries. If the European Central Bank only interferes with the total amount of money that the government spends, politicians will cater to local domestic political whims by reallocating the reduced amount of funds to politically sensitive priorities. It will only exacerbate the problem. The funds will be diverted to politically sensitive issues, and the problem will be perpetuated. The second thing you talked about was basically the examples of the European Central Bank setting conditions where states are borrowing money from it when they're near default. Well, you guys raised this. No, thank you. But what you guys said was that these conditions should be imposed everywhere. These guys specified a case of a country near default when it's borrowing money, and you guys applied it to the entire economy. There seems to be a contradiction there. The second thing, now, the member of government, no thank you, talked about how the European money market will basically improve, but the thing is that currency markets are heavily based on perception, and if the European Union is seen as manipulating its currency, it will affect it in an adverse way, because in the same way that the US and the European Union reacted to the Chinese influence of the currency in an unfair manner, these guys are also going to do it. Let me now move on to my constructive arguments. The first one of which is that there has to be this clash between fiscal and monetary policy, and if you give the ECB control over fiscal policy as well, it's going to break that distinction and ruin the economy. Why do we have this traditional differentiation between the source of fiscal policy, the government, and the source of monetary policy, the European Central Bank? Because in medieval Italy, you had kings spending way too much money. You needed someone to rein them in. Local central banks best serve this purpose of reining in spendthrift politicians, not some sort of international institution that limits total expenditure. Therefore, it is good, and what you guys are suggesting will completely ruin this. Let me now move on to the more important point, which is the story of Europe. All of us want the European Union and Europe to do well. Now, we need to briefly look at the past for this. No, thank you. We need to briefly look at the past for this. These guys talked a little bit about why the European Union sort of came about, right? They needed a common currency because they wanted like complete free trade among them, because they would benefit all of them. That is why they wanted, deficit to be less than 3%. They wanted a strong currency. That is as far as the EU's mandate goes. It has no right whatsoever to influence how the governments keep that deficit below 3%. All they have to worry about is keeping that deficit below 3%. Now, what will happen in the present? Ladies and gentlemen, Europe is a unique continent, and each of its countries has really specific and really difficult to deal with structural problems. One of the teams on this side admitted it, in fact in a POI that I think we raised earlier, that the reason why even some sort of control that the Federal Reserve may exercise on states doesn't work is because each of these states has its own unique problems. California, for example. The same is true of Europe. Let me give you two examples. No, thank you. The first example being Portugal. Now, Portugal has a very strong labor union movement, and the government, when it had to cut its total expenditure, could not cut the amount of money it gave to these labor unions because it was politically necessary for them to do this. Basically, you had the European Central Bank telling them not to spend as much, but they had domestic legislation and domestic political priorities that prevented them from doing this. The other example is Greece. Now, it's easy to say that the problems that we have in Greece were a result of the European Central Bank failing in oversight. I think it's important to remind everyone that the reason why we had such a problem in Greece was that Greece fudged figures. It's because Greece lied to international institutions for a very long time and suddenly decided to come out with the truth when it had to, when it had no choice. all that your policy will do is incentivize the act of lying and fudging figures for countries. It's never going to solve any problem. Yeah, I'll take your point now.
Okay, so the point is then, we have a budget of what Greece said it was going to do. We can compare it to what they are actually doing and catch them lying about it much sooner and deal with the issues much sooner.
Okay. The problem is that when you talk about fudging figures, well, you can lie about any figures. You can lie about like allocation of resources as well as total expenditure. Countries can lie either way. That really is not an argument for it. Let me move on to the third very important point, which is basically it's going to impact the future of the EU. If you have countries, both current members and prospective members, seeing that the European Central Bank is basically overstepping its mandate, they're not going to want to join the EU. If the European Central Bank is going to be seen as a stimulus of these downward spirals. No, thank you. As I said before, that there's a very important boundary between fiscal policy and monetary policy. You cannot have a few economists in Brussels dictating the monetary as well as fiscal policy of all these countries with their unique problems, because they simply do not work. And countries will leave the EU and countries will not join the EU. Let me quickly sum up what we said. We've said that the distinction between the source of fiscal policy and the source of monetary policy is tremendously important, because you need this kind of conflict between the two to prevent either of them overstepping their boundaries. We have shown that this is the historical reason for why it came about, and it should stay for a healthy Europe. We have shown you that basically the history of the EU is that you needed an institution which focused on cooperation, not imposition, as these guys seem to suggest. And this thing needs to stay. It's going to affect the future of the EU, because if the EU is seen as overstepping its mandate, current members will leave and future members will not want to join. And we've also shown you that any attempt to seriously dictate the fiscal policy of these countries will fail because of the unique problems that they have, the examples being Portugal and Greece. For all these reasons, I am proud to close.
Alright, I'd like to thank the previous speaker for his remarks, and now call upon Irene to close out the this time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've got a lot to say, so I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to pretty much simple structure. Go over everything the last speaker said, told you why, tell you why his constructive points do not stand, and then go into the summary of the round. And these are the three ideas of sovereignty, of collective versus the individual, and lastly, this idea of what would happen otherwise, which I think Emily addressed incredibly well, which pretty much was unanswered on that side. But let's go into this reputation. We found there's two points where really can collapse into one, so I'll just repeat them in that sense. So the first thing he told us that they're separated for good reasons, right? But what we tell you on our side of the house, we think we told you this up and down, and is that during the time of crisis, they are not that separate anymore, right? During a time of crisis, one needs the other and one depends on the other. For example, when we look at when the U.S. went into a crisis in 2008, right? They had Lehman Brothers needed money from the Federal Reserves. These two are very much connected in a time of crisis because the other one cannot survive. Right? The state would not be able to survive if they wasn't for the money, lender of last resort that will fund them out otherwise. But the second one he told us is the idea that it's a unique problem within every single country. And this is actually pretty much the same as the second point, which is the idea of diversity among the different countries in the EU. On our side of the house, we fully recognize that every country is very different. We recognize that Spain has different problems from Portugal, which has different problems from Greece. And we think our plan very much take this into consideration, Mr. Speaker. And we're very much for all of these countries having diversity, but we say we address it on our side of the house. This is how, Mr. Speaker. We're not controlling distribution within each country, right? Greece can still allocate the money in any way within their budget, right? They can still spend, X number of percent on welfare. We're not saying you need to have, blah percent on welfare. You can do whatever you want. All we're saying is the overall budget should not exceed your taxation, right? That's the case lies on our side of the house. We're not controlling that sense of sovereignty. We're not controlling that specific sense. And in that sense, it allows for a lot of diversity that they want on their side of the house, Mr. Speaker, which we are very much for in this sense. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, we recognize that each country has a very individual relationship with the ECB, right? The ECB doesn't have just one blanket policy for every single country, right? They recognize that the need of individual countries is very different. And it's not even an EU vote of everybody voting on the same issue. It's very, me as Greece bank for what my needs are, and Spain talking for what their needs are. It's very, very separate. So in that sense, we think the preservation of diversity is just fine. We think that will remain just as is with our plan or with the current system. So second, let's go into the actual themes. The first idea is sovereignty, and I've actually touched on that a little bit. What they told you is really a loss of sovereignty, that they're not in control of their budget, not in control of taxation rate and whatnot. Firstly, what we're going to tell you on our side of the house is that EU is fundamentally different, right? Like, by coming into the EU, they've already given up parts of their sovereignty, right? Like, they have one foreign minister for the entirety of EU, Mr. Speaker. They've already given up on such a sense by joining a collective for the collective benefit. We say that if you want to join the collective, you have to give up certain things in order to reap the benefit of the collective, and such is one of these things, right? Like, but even if you don't buy that, Mr. Speaker, secondly, we're telling you we're not controlling individual aspects of the budget, and they're going to tell you, well, yeah, we're going to control taxation, what's really important for the budget. Yes, we agree taxation is very important, but we're not even coming close to telling them what they should do about taxation, right? Like, we're not saying, from now on, you should, like, reduce taxation, or, like, increase it, or whatever it is. All we're saying is your overall spending of your budget should not exceed, or not just significantly exceed that taxation. So we don't think we're controlling or taking away sovereignty really anyway, Mr. Speaker. But let's go on to the second idea. Like, when does the collective trump the individual? Like, when do they get to control that? And I think Emily really effectively addressed all of this. Like, the first government touched on this a little bit, saying that one affects all. Like, downfall of Greece will affect all of the union, and therefore they should take some responsibility. But Emily gave you further development on this, right? And that's an idea that, you know, the ECB is actually the lender of last resort, right? Like, that's one pool of money that people come to if they simply don't have any other options. It's just much like the reserves, right, Mr. Speaker? So in this sense, that is the same pool of money for everybody. And in that sense, it's a limited amount of money that we simply cannot just distribute to everybody. There's a limited amount there as to how much we can give to each country. So in that sense, we think if you want that money, you have to act responsibly in order to get a share of that. Because that money is not just for you, Mr. Speaker, it's for the entirety of EU. And we think in that sense it's very important. Furthermore, Emily's told you how, like, the scare is very, like, significant when Greece, Spain, and Portugal, all three countries, were, like, practically collapsing the euro. And the need to pay, in that sense, it's very significant. And that kind of scare is real, right, Mr. Speaker? And in that sense, we think it's very important. Go ahead.
How are you solving for the unique economic needs of each of these countries if your veto, as your partner said, will be used to create a blanket ban on deficit spending?
We're saying that you shouldn't go over your budget as responsible spending, right? But we're not saying for every single country you have, but, like, who says you have to go over budget in order to solve for your stuff in your country, right, Mr. Speaker? Like, I think that's just an assumption on their side of the house. You don't have to fundamentally go over budget to solve the uniqueness. If you need more money on welfare, cut defense to spend on welfare. You don't have to fundamentally go overboard, right, Mr. Speaker? And we think that's the kind of sovereignty that we're giving them, and that's sovereignty we have on our side of the house, which they don't seem to understand. But anyway, secondly, Mr. Speaker, under this idea of collective versus individual, Emily told you about the politicians, right? How in each country, each politicians only care about a short-term gain about elections. Well, they said that they can simply reallocate the fund, but Mr. Speaker, they can simply reallocate the fund within. That was a rebuttal to this. But Mr. Speaker, we can still see that they can just pander in other senses, right? Like within the system, like politicians have, like they'll pander no matter what. But under our system, they have to pander within the budget. We think that's pretty good on our side of the house, even if they must pander, which we think is a pretty bad thing to begin with. But lastly, let's look at what will happen otherwise. And we think this is a really important point, right? Like, if the last lender resort runs out of money, or, you know, not even that, just right now, because of the lower interest rate that's coming from foreign funds like China, it makes people turn to them if they were to overspend, if they were to go into a deficit, right, Mr. Speaker? Because our plan is really trying to prevent deficits from happening overall, right? But if it were to happen under the current system, they're going to turn to China, which has low interest rates. And that's going to have this political pull and political weight overall, not directly, Mr. Speaker, but in a very indirect and real sense that threatens, you know, in that sense, you know, that threatens the sovereignty of a country because of an outside influence. To this, you know, we got, like, you know, well, the US and UK should just, like, you know, like, other countries should realize how bad China is and just regulate them. Well, two responses is, one, we think in a time of despair, you're not going to consider a lot of these things. Like, if you need money now, you're just going to go to whatever's the cheapest, whatever's will best avail, right? But secondly, Mr. Speaker, we say China didn't opt into any sort of system the way EU did. So China has leverage over to UK and US the way that's very different from that of, like, a EU state, right? So for all of these reasons, we proudly propose.
Alright.
Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, the question really is, where does the business of Brussels stop? And we tell you that it stops where it currently is. And we tell you this on 3 grounds. First, the contention between fiscal and monetary policy and why we win that point and why we say these must remain separate, and the extension that Kieran brought to you and why it's good that they are separate, as the first opposition said they are in the status quo. Second, the story of Europe and why exactly on our side of the house we protected it both by remaining faithful to its past, to its present, and also by projecting the merits into the future. And third, on the idea of the sovereignty of the state, which we believe that on this side of the house they've really muddled. So, on to the first, right? On first opposition, we've heard some really good analysis coming out by saying that these two are separate, right? That these two aren't conflated in the status quo, right? But what we've shown to you conclusively on our side of the house is the origins of why they came to be separate, ladies and gentlemen. On their side of the house, they have this really messy and hazy notion that they're conflated because they're somehow interrelated. Yes, they are, ladies and gentlemen, but they're interrelated in this manner. They're interrelated such that when one behaves in an irresponsible way, one behaves in a reprehensible manner, the other can rein it in. Not when they behave as a monolithic block that spirals out of control. And we believe that on their side of the house, by bringing both together under one common institution, they're effecting exactly that. They're not creating this to use, to use an American term, separation of powers that really is the driving engine for why exactly fiscal and monetary policy behaves separately, ladies and gentlemen. Which is why on our side of the house, we stand for continued separation of fiscal and monetary policy, because we believe that the European Union can affect these individual societies' economic behavior by controlling the currency, but definitely by not controlling the amount or even the distribution of these resources, and we'll get back to that in a bit. Now, the question really is, ladies and gentlemen, how does this impact the story of Europe? Because what we've told you that the story of Europe, and by specifically the European Union, ladies and gentlemen, is not the story of a reckless concession of vital state functions, which they believe what it means to enter the European Union as a social contract means. What they've told you that part of entering the EU is giving up part of your sovereignty, but we believe it is not conceding the very vital state functions and state identity of the ways European institutions have and will continue to behave. So we've told you 3 things. We've told you that this story has a past, a present, and a future, right? On the question of the past, we've told you that the European Union has a very clear institutional identity with which it was born. And that institutional identity is the idea of states independently coming together in a concerted manner. They come together to form consensus, not to submit themselves onto an impositional force of the European Central Bank, which that is at the House wants to level. Second, on the subject of the present, right, we tell you that their policy fundamentally won't work, because what is impeding the progress of the European Central Bank, as Kieran very clearly brought to you on the side of extension, right, was this idea that it is not really about the ECB failing to act, but rather that there's deep ingrained, I'll take you in a moment, Irie, these deep ingrained problems like Portugal and how it's helpless about the fact that its labor unions are draining money, and like Greece and how it itself is helpless about the fact that its contractors are fudging figures. But you disagree?
But okay, in this sense, wouldn't foreign country financing fiscal debts also wouldn't that also let Greece, Spain, and Portugal lose sovereignty?
Thank you so much for bringing up foreign capital, because that's exactly what the future of the European story is going to be all about. 2 things. They've hung their hat. Irene and Emily have pretty much hung their hat on this idea that foreign capital is important because they're from overseas and they think it's cool to bring in foreign ideas. And we agree because foreign ideas are absolutely important. But what does this do to the flow of foreign capital? Kieran brought this point up, but let me repeat it to them in economically more conducive words, ladies and gentlemen. If the European money market under the aegis of the ECB is seen to be playing a trump card, if it's seen to be benefiting as a manner of concerted action that other states can't take at the expense of other currencies such as the yen or the Chinese renminbi or the US dollar, right? What will happen is a decrease in the amount of foreign capital that flows in this country, not the increase that they on their side of the house want to believe will happen by ECB intervention. No, ladies and gentlemen. what Kirat has told you is that 3 very important impacts on the European future will occur. A, countries might not join, countries might leave, sure, very important thing, but the absolute most important thing, perceptions matter, and that what these perceptions of the ECB manipulating money markets will create, ladies and gentlemen, is this perception that Europe is benefiting at other people's expenses. A, we say these benefits are not being accrued, at the same time these perceptions are going to lead to a decreased amount of capital flowing into the European Union societies, and we've told you very clearly that this foreign capital, and Emily and Irene completely agree because that's pretty much what their entire extension amounted to, that this foreign capital is important. So we say if you really stand for foreign capital, we say subscribe to the story of Europe that we are bringing forward to you, because both the past, the present, and the future of the European story really conforms to what this side of the house has shown you very clearly that it believes in. But quickly on this sovereignty of the state, because that also that came out pretty much throughout the 3 teams on today's side of the house, right? So under what they've brought to you is that we're only limiting how much you can spend, right? Not quite how exactly this budget is passed. And we said that's fine. That was a strategic concession they made when we said that states can't poke their face in, right? No. So we say that because they've already conceded that states can't poke in, they say that when you cut the budget, what will happen is that, oh, you cut defenses, and this came out directly from Irene's speech, you cut defenses. The problem is, ladies and gentlemen, the countries we're really talking about here, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Ireland, they're not exactly spending millions of dollars paying for news. They're spending their money on things like funding labor unions that refuse to be retrenched from work because of what social values and the legal books have come to tell them, ladies and gentlemen. The very structural problems that we've brought to you on our side of the house, we've told you this is really the reason. So what Kirat has told you very clearly on this matter is that when you're shrinking this budget, right, when you're shrinking this budget without even being able to say where these budgets go to, these go to politically sensitive targets, not the structural problems, which is very clearly where the problem really lies, ladies and gentlemen. So, to summarize, ladies and gentlemen, on fiscal versus monetary, we've heard some good ideas about why the separation exists. We've told you why it's crucial. Second, on the story of Europe, on our side of the house, we protect the past, present, and future of Europe. Third, we've told you that if they really care about the sovereignty of Europe, then you should strictly side with our side of the house. For this reason, we've been proud to oppose this.
Thanks very much, and I thank all the teams and ask them to shake hands if they are. Everyone, we're going to decide in here, so I don't know. We'll check. Come back here. We'll let you know. To go home, but you can't stay here. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Were you assaulting them?